Welcome to 1189, an online Bible commentary. My name is Tyler Marston, and today we're taking a look at Genesis chapter 37. Now, if we remember back in the first act, chapters 1 through 11, we remember how God created a good world, a perfect world. And the jewel in the crown of creation was humankind, and they were made in the image of God. They were created to rule and reign over creation and reflect God's nature and qualities back to the rest of His creation, according to His wisdom and power. The problem was that humanity rejected that calling. They wanted the power, they wanted to rule over the earth, but they wanted to do it according to their own wisdom, to what they thought looked like good and evil. Every sin, every rebellion, everything that came afterwards, that corruption of humanity, came from somebody who thought that what they were doing was good and not evil, according to their own wisdom, not according to God's. But God promised to bring a restoration of Eden back to the world. He says there's going to be a descendant who will rise up and crush that snake, which represents the powers of sin and lies and death. He's going to crush it forever. But that descendant is not going to do it effortlessly, right? The salvation of humanity will come through his own personal suffering. We saw that he will crush the head, but he will get his heel bitten in the process. Now, obviously, that's a foreshadowing of Jesus' death and resurrection, right? Because Jesus is the descendant God promised. But as far as Genesis is concerned, I don't think it's a coincidence that the character that fits that archetype the best is Joseph, whose story is put as the climax of the book. Joseph's suffering is going to come from the jealousy of his brothers, just like in the Cain story. Now in chapter 4, that jealousy, that sin, that plot to murder led to Abel's death. But Joseph's story is going to take a cosmic turn. God is going to intervene and show that He is the God of life. So I know that was a long recap of 36 chapters of the Bible, but I think they're all really important to understanding what the Joseph story is all about. So let's get into it. Joseph, when 17 years of age, was pasturing the flock with his brothers while he was still a youth, along with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father. So let's remember, Joseph is the 11th born son, but he's the firstborn son of Jacob's most loved wife, which was Rachel. So as all his sons are out shepherding Jacob's flocks, we see that Joseph comes back to his father and gives a bad report about his brothers. Now, this really shouldn't be surprising. We've seen some of his brothers' screw-ups in past chapters, right? Reuben slept with Bilhah, one of Jacob's wives. Simeon and Levi deceived, looted, and massacred an entire city in an effort to get revenge and retribution. Joseph, right from the beginning, calls it like he sees it, right? And he gives a bad report to his father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all of his sons, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a varicolored tunic. His brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, and so they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms. Now, in comparison to all the other kids, Joseph is the perfect kid, especially in Jacob's eyes, and he makes for him a fancy garment. Now, contrary to popular belief, we don't actually know what the coat of many colors looked like. The word is very ambiguous in the original Hebrew. It's the phrase ketanit pasim, which actually is used elsewhere in the Bible in 2 Samuel, talking about David's daughters who are princesses and the garments they wear. But in that story, most of our English translations translate it to the word for long-sleeved garment. And there's a lot of different theories, a lot of different interpretations of what this ketanit pasim really could have looked like. Was it a tunic, a robe, a coat, right? Was it full length? Was it long-sleeved? Was it embroidered? Did it actually have many colors? Regardless, what we do know is it was fancy, and it signified a social status, right? David's daughters were princesses. They were royalty. And in the same way, Joseph is getting this royal treatment from his father. And his brothers resent that because Jacob's playing favorites. And let's just take inventory of the unwise choices that has got us to this point in this family. Jacob's parents, Isaac and Rebekah, played favorites first when Isaac preferred Esau and Rebekah preferred Jacob. And Rebekah was willing to deceive Isaac in order to get a blessing for Jacob over Esau. Later, Jacob is deceived by Laban, who ends up giving him 2 wives, right? And each of the wives hate each other, and they're scheming to try and get more kids than the other one. And that's where Bilhah and Zilpah come in, Jacob's other wives. Of course, Jacob is not blameless in that, right? He could have said no to any of the wives. He could have just been content with Leah, but he wasn't. His lust for women was more important to him than building a healthy family, a family that looked like the one in Eden. But finally, Joseph's brothers don't seem to be helping their case either because of their wicked, messed up pasts. So just notice how the sins of parents affect the sins of kids, right? But a bad family life is not an excuse to sin. Joseph is the perfect example of that. Even out of this messy situation, Joseph is going to live the most righteous life of any of the characters in this book of Genesis. Then Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Please listen to this dream which I've had. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf rose up and also stood erect, and behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf." Then his brother said to him, "Are you actually going to reign over us? Are you really going to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Now this dream really makes the brothers mad. And when they say, "Are you really going to reign and rule over us?" it's a variation on Jacob's life, when God told Rebekah that the older would serve the younger. Now the older brothers of Joseph are going to serve the younger brother, Joseph. And let's not forget that ruling and reigning was what God called all humans to in the beginning, right? In the Garden of Eden, their job was to rule and reign over the creation. And that will be even more clear in the next dream. Now he had still another dream and related it to his brothers and said, "Lo, I have had another dream. And behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me." He related it to his father and to his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream you have had? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come to bow ourselves before you to the ground?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. Right, so this second dream talks about how not just the brothers will bow down to him, but even Jacob and Leah. We know the moon is Leah since Rachel has already died at this point. And even Jacob is upset by this. He rebukes Joseph for telling him this. But again, this plays back into that creation, that image of God thing that we were talking about. Because remember in the 7-day creation story, how God created the sun and moon and stars and designated them, delegated them to rule over the seasons and over the times. And it's kind of like how at the end of this story, spoiler alert, Joseph will be in charge of the seasons of famine and feast. And notice again how both dreams together use that heaven and earth imagery. The sheaves on earth bow to Joseph, just like the stars in heaven are bowing to Joseph. It's a unification of heaven and earth, right? The recovery of Eden, of God with his people. We talked about that before with Jacob's ladder and with how Abraham was promised to have descendants as numerous as the sand on the sea and the stars in the sky. Now God is giving these dreams to Joseph to show him that he's going to use him in a big way. He's choosing Joseph to bring deliverance to himself and to all the families of the earth, just like he promised he would through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But for his brothers, they don't see that Joseph's calling is for their good too. They don't see that yet. They just see a threat to their position and social status, and how their dad has skipped over all of them in the line of succession. They think Joseph is rubbing it in, and they know how they haven't measured up in the eyes of their father. They're projecting their own insecurities and failures onto Joseph, and it creates jealousy and hatred that leads to a feeling of wanting to kill, just like Cain. In verses 12 through 17, Jacob sends out Joseph to go check on his brothers who are pasturing his flock again. And it's interesting because they're not where they said they would be. There's already some deception, some sneaky things going on. When they saw him, Joseph, from a distance, and before he came to them, they plotted against him to put him to death. They said to one another, "Here comes the dreamer. Now then, come and let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits, and we will say, 'A wild beast devoured him.' Then let us see what will become of his dreams." They know they got a bad report last time Joseph checked on them. They're feeling all these feelings of jealousy and insecurity and hatred, just like Cain. And so the brothers scheme to kill him in a field, just like Cain. And they plan to lie to cover it up, just like Cain tried to do with God. Now, what comes next is a very interesting part of the story. But Reuben heard this and rescued him out of their hands and said, "Let us not take his life." Reuben further said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit that is in the wilderness, but do not lay hands on him, that he might rescue him out of their hands to restore him to his father." So Reuben is the oldest, and he says, "Hey guys, crazy idea. What if we didn't kill Joseph?" And he specifically says, "Shed no blood." Remember, back in the Cain and Abel story, the reason God knew that Abel had died was because his blood was crying out to him from the ground. And then in chapter 9, after the flood, God condemns anyone who sheds human blood, and he says, "Whoever sheds blood, his blood will be required." So Reuben suggests that instead of killing him, they just throw him in a pit, because secretly he has a plan to rescue Joseph out of that pit and bring him back to his father. And while this seems like a really noble and heroic thing to do, there's debate on whether Reuben has good intentions or not. Remember, Jacob probably hates Reuben more than any of his other kids because he was the oldest who tried to usurp the position of his father by sleeping with his maid Bilhah. Maybe by doing all this, he's trying to win back the love and affection from Jacob by returning his most favorite son to him. I mean, he doesn't say, "Hey guys, let's not kill him, let's just leave him alone." He says, "Let's throw him in a pit and make myself the hero." But whether his motivation was genuine or not, God uses it, and Joseph doesn't die because of it. So it came about when Joseph reached his brothers that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the varicolored tunic that was on him, and they took him and threw him into the pit. Now the pit was empty, without any water in it. So the brothers attack Joseph and leave him for dead in a well without water. The reason that's important is because wells are supposed to be places where water comes out of the ground. Life comes from places of desert, right? And a well without water is useless. It's dried up. It doesn't serve any purpose. Another interesting thing about this word pit is that it's used in places like Psalm 30 and Psalm 88 in parallel with the word Sheol. That's a Hebrew word referring to the underworld. Now, Sheol is not exactly hell as we would think about it today. It's more of just a general term meaning death. The death everyone experiences, even followers of God. We still die. And so even though Joseph is not dead yet, he is in a place of death. He's in this underground pit, this well without water that's dried up, and he's as good as dead to his brothers. Then they sat down to eat a meal. And as they raised their eyes and looked, behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming from Gilead, with their camels bearing aromatic gum and balm and myrrh, on their way to bring them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and not lay hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers listened to him. Then some Midianite traders passed by, so they pulled him up and lifted Joseph out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. Thus they brought Joseph into Egypt. So they see these Ishmaelite traders with all these riches, right? All these items of significance that are expensive, right? And Judah, who's the fourthborn and who we haven't heard much about yet, is very opportunistic. He realizes that if they sell Joseph into slavery, that they can actually profit off of Joseph's death. On the one hand, it makes it even more cruel, but on the other hand, notice how Joseph is rescued from death so that God can use him in the future. It's kind of like Hagar, who was an Egyptian slave who was in the wilderness about to die of thirst when she was rescued by the hand of God. And she was delivered so her son Ishmael could turn into a great nation and be the ancestor of these very traders that Joseph's brothers are selling him to. So clearly God, in his sovereignty, is providing for Joseph. He's still with him, even though it looks hopeless. It looks like nothing but greed and slavery and evil. But God is going to turn that for good. Now Reuben returned to the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit. So he tore his garments. He returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is not there. As for me, where am I to go?" So Reuben, unfortunately, does not get the memo that Joseph has been sold into slavery. And when he comes back to the pit, he grieves and he tears his clothes. Reuben is a really complex character, and he's a really interesting part of this story. So what the brothers do to cover their tracks is they take Joseph's special garment and dip it in goat's blood and give it to Jacob. Once again, the former deceiver becomes the deceived when he believes that Joseph was killed by a wild animal on his journey. So Jacob tore his clothes and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. Then all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, "Surely I will go down to Sheol in mourning for my son." So his father wept for him. And Jacob is naturally grieved by the loss of his son Joseph. He's actually even more grieved than his brothers thought he would be. He says he won't stop mourning for Joseph until he goes down to Sheol, which we talked about was that underworld pit of death, just like the pit of death that Joseph was thrown in. The brothers' deception breaks Jacob, right? He's a broken man for the rest of the story. But look at what happens next. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, Pharaoh's officer, the captain of the bodyguard. Really, Joseph is alive, and God has rescued him. Even though he's in Egypt, even though he's a slave, he's still alive, and God has a plan for him, and he's going to use him. So we see that the effects of sin that started all the way back in the Garden of Eden have twisted and escalated into this amped up version of the Cain and Abel story. And just like in chapter 4, the announcement of God's promise and blessing results in jealousy from the brothers. They take it as a threat and they plot and scheme to kill their brother Joseph. At the last moment, though, greed overtakes their lust for blood, and they sell Joseph into slavery. And they use Jacob's partiality against him in order to deceive him into thinking that Joseph is dead. Nevertheless, the God of life is working in the background, and he has delivered Joseph out of the pit of certain death. And his promise to Joseph about his brothers bowing down to him will come true. Joseph will be put in a position of authority over his brothers. And it won't be for Joseph's glory, but it'll all be for God's glory. The only God who can take the situation of sin and death and turn it into life and goodness and blessing. That's the kind of God we serve, and that's the kind of person we can be if we follow God's wisdom and trust in him. Thanks for watching 1189. Joseph's story is so cool, and it's so cool to see how it wraps up the whole book of Genesis together. So I hope that you come back and watch as we go through the rest of Genesis. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. God bless.